Imagine for a second, right, that you are building a house.
Hmm.
You go to the hardware store, you buy a tape measure,
Hmm.
and you use it to cut every single piece of wood for this house.
Right.
And you just trust that tape measure completely.
Hmm.
I mean, a meter is a meter, right? You don't really question it. You just measure the physical world, write down the number, and move on.
Exactly. Yeah. It's a given.
But now, imagine someone walks onto your construction site, picks up your tape measure, and tells you that the lines on that tape aren't just arbitrary markings that we humans agreed upon.
Uh-huh.
They tell you that the exact length of a meter is actually dictated by, like, a hidden, higher dimensional geometric code that governs the entire universe. I mean, you'd probably look at them like they were crazy.
Oh, absolutely. And honestly, that reaction makes perfect sense. Because in our everyday experience, and frankly, in standard physics, we are completely conditioned to just accept measurements as raw facts of nature.
Right.
We measure things, we categorize them, and we rarely, if ever, ask if the number itself has a deeper architectural purpose.
Well, today, we are going to ask exactly that. So welcome to the deep dive. And we are talking directly to you today, the learner. We know the profile of the person listening right now.
We really do.
You're someone who loves to peer behind the curtain of reality, someone looking for those profound aha moments where the universe suddenly makes just a little more sense. But you also don't want to get buried in impenetrable jargon or, chalkboard equations that take a PhD to decipher.
Yeah, nobody wants that.
Exactly. You want the insight. You want to see the code behind the matrix.
Which is an incredibly tall order when we are dealing with theoretical physics. I mean, it is a field famous for its diagnostic muddy waters. But the source material we're unpacking today cuts through that mud in a way that is genuinely startling.
It really is. So we are looking at a revolutionary paper by George James Dukas. It carries a pretty heavy title. It's called The Speed of Light from Dimensional Recursion and Golden Ratio Harmonics. And it incorporates a framework known as the Transdimensional Unified Field Theory version 6, or TDUFT. Now, I know that sounds like straight-up science fiction, but the mission of this deep dive is to explore a beautifully elegant, mind-bending premise.
And it's a premise that challenges something we take for granted every single day.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are all taught in school that the speed of light in a vacuum, what physicists call SKI, is exactly 299,792,458 meters per second.
Yes.
That is the ultimate speed limit of the universe. Nothing can go faster. But if you stop a physicist and ask, why is it that exact number? Like, why isn't it an even 300 million? Why isn't it 50? What do they usually say?
Well, they will essentially throw their hands up. Mainstream physics considers the speed of light to be an empirical constant.
Meaning what, exactly?
That means it is a number we have physically measured using lasers and atomic clocks, and we just accept it. We tune our equations to match that exact measurement. Standard physics basically says, it is what it is, don't ask why.
Wow.
Yeah, there is no underlying theory for why the number is exactly 299,792,458.
And that is exactly what this paper refuses to accept. Dukas proposes that the speed of light is not just some random number we happen to measure. It's a structural code, a literal blueprint built entirely on the golden ratio in discrete layers of dimensional reality.
So we are going to look at a model of the universe where pure geometry is the scaffold. It is the invisible foundation of the house you were talking about.
Right.
And the physical constants that we measure with such extreme precision in our laboratories, they are really just the shadows of that higher geometry falling into our three-dimensional world.
Okay, I want to stop right there because that sounds incredibly poetic, but we need to ground it. To really understand this theory, we have to start by looking at how the author literally redefines the math of the speed of light. Let's look at the actual components.
Absolutely.
Dukas proposes a brand new formula for C, and the engine driving this entire formula is a number we see in art and nature all the time, the golden ratio.
Represented by the Greek letter phi. And if we're looking at its decimal form, it is roughly 1.618. Most people know the golden ratio from its aesthetic applications. We see it in the spiral of a nautilus shell, the arrangement of seeds in a sunflower, the proportions of classical architecture like the Parthenon.
Yeah, it's often described as the most beautiful proportion in the universe.
Exactly. But in the context of this physics paper, we have to strip away the aesthetics. We are not talking about beauty here. We are talking about deep, unyielding algebra.
Let's actually talk about that algebra, because I remember learning about phi in a design class, but I never realized how mathematically bizarre it actually is. The algebraic identity of the golden ratio has a property that literally no other number has.
That's right. If you take the golden ratio, phi, and you square it, the result is exactly equal to phi plus 1.
Wait, let me just make sure I'm wrapping my head around that. So 1.618 squared is equal to 1.618 plus 1, which is 2.618.
Precisely. It is the only positive number in the universe that works that way. It defines itself through its own addition.
That is wild.
It is. Now, because of that unique property, it creates another mathematical miracle when you look at its inverses, meaning 1 divided by phi.
Okay.
If you take the inverse of phi and you add it to the inverse of phi squared, those two numbers add up to exactly perfectly 1.0.
So 1 divided by 1.618 plus 1 divided by 2.618 equals exactly 1.
Yes. Keep that mathematical mechanism in your pocket because it is the beating heart of the speed of light equation proposed in this paper.
All right, let's put the formula on the table then. We won't get bogged down in reciting a long string of math, but conceptually, Dukas sets up an equation for the speed of light. He starts with a base number of 2.
Right.
Then he adds those two golden ratio inverses we just talked about.
And as we just established, those two inverses perfectly sum up to 1.
So the front half of his equation is really just 2 plus 1, which gives us a perfect whole number of 3.
A completely rigid, mathematically pure 3.
But the speed of light isn't perfectly 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second. It's 2.9979. So to account for that, inside this equation, after the perfect 3, Dukas subtracts a tiny, tiny fraction. He uses the Greek letter epsilon to represent it. And this epsilon has an exact value of 0.00007542.
Right.
So you take the perfect 3, you subtract that tiny epsilon fraction, and you multiply the whole thing by 10 to the 8th power. If you do that, the math spits out exactly 299,792,458, the exact speed of light.
Now, I need to pause us right here and explain a critical concept. The difference between an eigenvalue and numerology. Because without understanding that distinction, this just looks like someone playing with a calculator until they get the answer they want.
Oh, I'm so glad you brought that up, because honestly, my first instinct when reading this was total skepticism. I can hear people listening to this right now thinking, wait a minute.
Yeah, of course.
Couldn't anyone just take a famous number like the golden ratio, add some other integers to it, and then magically subtract a highly specific tiny decimal just to force the math to hit the speed of light?
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like reverse engineering.
Oh, it totally does.
It sounds like you could do that with pi, or the square root of 2, if you just tried hard enough to manipulate the remaining fractions.
That is the exact trap of numerology. Numerology is when you take a data point you already know and you arbitrarily smash different numbers together until they fit without any underlying physical reason.
Right.
But what this paper is presenting is the exact opposite. It is presenting an eigenvalue.
Okay, explain eigenvalue for me, because that's one of those words physicists throw around that makes the rest of us feel completely lost.
Well, think of a guitar string. When you pluck the A string on a perfectly tuned acoustic guitar, it vibrates at exactly 110 hertz.
Okay.
It doesn't vibrate at 109, it doesn't vibrate at 111, it naturally, inevitably settles into that exact 110 hertz frequency because of the physical tension, the length of the string, and the mass of the metal.
I follow you.
That natural structural resonance is its eigenvalue. You didn't force the string to vibrate at 110 hertz by doing some math trick. The physical geometry of the string demanded it.
So you're saying the 3 in this equation isn't a random number Dukas picked. It's the natural acoustic resonance, the eigenvalue of the universe's geometry.
Exactly. The paper argues that the number 3 is an ideal geometric state. It represents perfect structural closure. And that tiny decimal we subtracted, that epsilon of 0.002, is not a fudge factor thrown in to make the equation match our human measurements.
Wait, really?
Really, it is a calculated structural necessity. It represents a physical phenomenon, a leakage, which we will explore deeply later. But to address your skepticism about reverse engineering, the author completely anticipates that critique.
How does he defend against it? Because I promise, it's an eigenvalue isn't going to satisfy a peer reviewer.
He defends it by proving that this specific equation is structurally overdetermined.
Overdetermined, meaning what, exactly?
Meaning that if this equation were just a mathematical parlor trick designed solely to mimic the speed of light, it would be completely useless everywhere else.
Oh, I see.
The moment you tried to plug this specific golden ratio formulation into other areas of physics, like electromagnetism or quantum mechanics, it would fall apart and give you gibberish. But it doesn't.
Wow.
Dukas proves that this exact equation independently solves major mysteries in 5 completely distinct foundational areas of physics.
Okay, that is a massive claim. If this equation is truly the secret architectural blueprint of reality, It shouldn't just explain light. It should explain the other seemingly random numbers in physics. So let's test that. Let's move into electromagnetism. This is where the paper offers its first major validation.
To understand why this validation is so profound, we need to take a quick detour back to the 19th century to a physicist named James Clerk Maxwell.
Right, the father of electromagnetism.
Maxwell is the giant here. He took everything we knew about static electricity and magnets and combined them into a single set of equations.
And in doing so, he accidentally discovered what light actually is.
Right. He did. He realized that changing electric fields create magnetic fields, and changing magnetic fields create electric fields. They basically leapfrog off each other, creating a self-sustaining wave.
Okay.
Maxwell wanted to know how fast this electromagnetic wave would travel, so he calculated its speed using two other measurements that had already been taken in a laboratory.
What were those measurements?
Vacuum permittivity and vacuum permeability.
Okay, remind me what those are.
Permittivity is essentially a measure of how much a vacuum resists the formation of an electric field. Permeability is how much a vacuum resists the formation of a magnetic field. Think of them as the stiffness of empty space.
I like that, the stiffness of space.
Maxwell took the formula, 1 divided by the square root of permittivity multiplied by permeability, and he calculated the speed. The number that popped out was exactly the known speed of light. That was the moment humanity realized that light itself is just an electromagnetic wave.
Which is one of the most beautiful moments in the history of science.
Absolutely.
But standard physics has a very weird relationship with those two vacuum constants, permittivity and permeability, don't they?
They do. In the Standard International System of Units, SI units, if you multiply the vacuum permittivity and permeability together, the number you get is incredibly strange. It comes out to roughly 1 over 9 times 10 to the 16th power.
Let's focus on that 9, because in a universe full of chaotic decimals, a perfect integer like 9 showing up in a foundational electromagnetic constant feels like it should be highly important. But how do modern textbooks treat that 9?
They brush it right under the rug.
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
In standard metrology, that perfect 9 is considered an artifact, an accident. The logic basically goes like this. Well, we arbitrarily decided how long a meter is based on a piece of metal in France, and we arbitrarily decided how long a second is based on the rotation of the Earth.
Right.
So, of course, when you smash all these human-made units together, occasionally you're going to get a neat-looking integer by pure random chance. They treat it as a metrological coincidence. Nothing good to see here.
But the TDUFT framework looks at that 9 and says, that is absolutely not a coincidence.
Far from it. The paper takes Ducas's new ideal speed of light and plugs it back into Maxwell's formula. Now, remember what we said the ideal speed of light was in this framework before we subtract the tiny epsilon leakage?
It was the pure integer 3. 3 times 10 to the 8th.
Right. So, if Maxwell's equation relies on the speed of light squared, what happens when you square Ducas's ideal speed of light?
Well, 3 squared is exactly 9, and 10 to the 8th squared is 10 to the 16th. So you get exactly 9 times 10 to the 16th.
Exactly. This is why the overdetermination matters so much. The framework turns an empirical constant, something standard physics thought was just a random byproduct of human measuring sticks, into a pure geometric identity.
That's incredible.
That 9 is not an accident of the metric system. It is the literal square of the Trinitarian sum of the golden ratio. The 2 plus the 1 harmonic gives us 3, and squaring that geometric foundation gives us the 9 that dictates how electric and magnetic fields interact in a vacuum.
I want to make sure I am visualizing this correctly. It's almost like, imagine you are an archaeologist, and you find the shadow of a massive, ancient obelisk cast on the desert sand.
Okay.
You use your tape measure, and you declare the shadow is this many meters long. You just accept it as a raw fact. The shadow is the measurement.
Right.
But the theory is like finally digging up the actual architectural blueprints of the people who built the obelisk. You look at the parchment and realize, oh, the length of the shadow wasn't a random occurrence. It was mathematically dictated by the exact geometric ratios of the foundation stones.
Yes.
Mainstream physics has been meticulously measuring the shadow of the speed of light this whole time. And Dukas is pointing to the blueprint and saying, look at the foundation.
That is an exceptional analogy. And if we look at that blueprint, we can actually read the specific foundation stones. We have been talking about these integers, the 2, the 1, the 3, and the 8 from the 10 to the 8th power. The math works perfectly, yes. But physics isn't just math. It has to represent reality.
Right. What do these numbers actually mean physically? Are they just digits on a page, or do they correspond to something happening in the universe?
This brings us to what the paper calls the dimensional codex. This is where the geometric scaffold actually becomes visible. In this framework, these numbers are not arbitrary quantities. They are structural labels for distinct levels of reality or dimensions.
When you say dimensions, I need to clarify for the listener. Are
Yeah.
we talking about sci-fi parallel universes, like an alternate dimension where I have an evil goatee?
No, not at all. In physics, a dimension is simply a degree of freedom. A line is one dimension. A flat sheet of paper is two dimensions. A cube is three dimensions.
Got it.
The Dimensional Codex is arguing that reality is built out of these discrete dimensional layers, and light is a mechanism that interacts with them. Let's start with the base integer in the equation, the 2. The paper refers to this as the D2 level.
The D2 level, the source material refers to this as the photon plane. Walk me through what a photon plane actually is.
Imagine a purely two-dimensional domain. It is completely flat. It has length and width, but absolutely zero depth. It has no volume whatsoever. According to the Codex, this D2 plane is the native environment for massless wavefronts.
Massless, so light.
Yes. In a 2D plane, electromagnetic field lines can spread out, and electric charge can exist and stabilize. But because there is no third dimension, there is no volume. And in physics, without volume, you cannot enclose anything.
Right.
If you cannot enclose anything, you cannot possess rest mass. Therefore, the D2 level is strictly a realm of massless propagation. It is the foundational floor for the speed of light.
Okay, I can picture that.
Oh.
A flat, energetic floor where light skims along without any mass. But we don't live in a flat universe. We live in a 3D world with massive objects.
Yep.
Planets, stars, people. So how do we get from the 2D photon plane to our world?
That requires the next part of the equation. We had the 2, and then we added the inverses of the golden ratio, phi to the -1 plus phi to the -2.
And what did we say those add up to?
Exactly.
That 1 is not just a mathematical placeholder. The Codex calls this the harmonic step. It is the exact minimum amount of golden ratio recursion required to climb out of the 2D plane. It is the dimensional increment needed to upgrade from a flat plane into a three-dimensional volume.
So 2 dimensions plus a 1-dimension harmonic step equals the number 3, the D3 level.
Yes, the D3 level represents volumetric closure. This is the three-dimensional space that you and I inhabit and interact with. Structurally, D3 is the absolute minimum dimensionality required for something to have inertia. It is the minimum requirement for rest mass to exist.
Because as you said earlier, you cannot have a physically massive object existing on a completely flat, volumeless plane. It needs depth to have stuff inside it.
Precisely. So the 3 in the ideal speed of light equation isn't just a number. It is a boundary marker. It is marking the exact dimensional threshold where mass becomes structurally possible in the universe.
Okay, we have the 2, the 1, and the 3. What about the 8? In the equation, we multiply the whole thing by 10 to the 8th power. That gives us the sheer magnitude of the speed of light, hundreds of millions of meters per second.
Well, in our standard base 10 decimal system, when we see 10 to the 8th, we just think of it as moving the decimal point 8 places to the right. It's just notation. But the Codex argues that our mathematical base 10 system itself is a metrological shadow of a deeper reality. The 8 represents an 8-layer dimensional descent.
Explain descent in this context. Descending from where?
The theory proposes that the fundamental structure of electromagnetism doesn't originate here in our 3D world, or even in the 2D photon plane. It originates at a highly complex, vastly higher dimensional level, specifically D8.
Whoa.
Yeah, but we cannot observe D8. So for that complex electromagnetic geometry to manifest as the light we can actually see and measure, it has to compress. It projects downward layer by layer, shedding degrees of freedom, folding in on itself through 8 distinct dimensional layers until it finally hits the D2 photon plane.
That is heavy. So you were saying the number 299,792,458 isn't merely a velocity limit on a particle flying through an empty void.
No.
That number is a literal geometric address. It is a map showing the descent of energy from an 8th-dimensional origin, compressing down to a 2D plane while carrying the exact harmonic potential to step up one level into a 3D volume.
That is exactly what it is. It is the operational code of the universe, written in the language of the golden ratio.
Okay, I have to stop and ask a question here because this is where my mind starts really racing.
Yeah.
If the D2 level is the flat realm of light and the D3 level is the realm of volume and mass, and they are separated by this one-unit harmonic step, does that mean light and mass are essentially the same thing, just existing on different sides of a dimensional fence?
That's a great way to think about it.
Because if you somehow pushed a photon hard enough, could you force it to cross that one-unit step, enter D3, and instantly turn into physical mass? Is there a literal gate between light and matter?
You have just intuited the second major validation of this paper. The theory argues that there is absolutely a gate. It calls it the mass permission gate.
The mass permission gate.
Yes. And this isn't just theoretical speculation. The paper uses this exact dimensional logic to calculate the threshold of that gate, and the number it produces makes direct contact with arguably the most famous experimental physics discovery of the 21st century.
The Higgs boson. The particle they found at CERN, sometimes called the God particle by the media. I won't spend real time on this because when I read this section of the source material, I had to put it down and walk away for a minute. It is that profound.
To appreciate how profound it is, we need to understand the Standard Model's explanation for mass. Before the Higgs boson was discovered in 2012, physics had a huge problem.
What was the problem?
The mathematical equations that perfectly described electromagnetism and the weak nuclear force required all fundamental particles to be completely massless. They had to travel at the speed of light. But obviously, we look around the universe and things have mass. Electrons have mass. Quarks have mass.
So the math said mass shouldn't exist, but reality said it did. How did standard physics fix that?
In the 1960s, Peter Higgs and others proposed a mechanism. They theorized an invisible energy field that permeates the entire universe. It's often compared to a thick field of molasses.
Right, the molasses analogy. I've heard this one.
The idea is that particles like photons zip right through the molasses without interacting with it, so they remain massless. But other particles, like electrons or quarks, interact with the molasses. They drag through it. That resistance, that drag, is what we perceive as mass.
Oh, I see.
And if you smash particles together hard enough, you can cause a little ripple in the molasses itself, which would manifest briefly as a particle. That ripple is the Higgs boson.
So in 2012, they turned on the Large Hadron Collider, smashed protons together at unimaginable speeds, and they saw the ripple. They found the Higgs boson. It proved the molasses field was real. Standard physics took a victory lap. So how does the TDUFT Codex challenge that?
It doesn't deny the experimental data from CERN. It fundamentally reinterprets what that data means. In the Dimensional Codex, mass emergence has nothing to do with dragging through a sticky, invisible field. Mass emergence is entirely about the dimensional transition you just asked about, the transition from the D2 plane to the D3 volume.
Crossing the gate.
Exactly. Dukas provides a specific formula to calculate the exact energetic threshold where that crossing is permitted. The formula is m sub v equals c times g times t, all divided by d squared.
Okay, let's look at the ingredients of that formula. The c is the speed of light, which makes sense, as it's the characteristic speed of the universe across these dimensions. Then we have g, which is Newton's gravitational constant. Why is gravity in there?
In this framework, gravity isn't just a force pulling masses together. It is viewed as a deep structural operator. It is a temporal inversion originating from an incredibly high dimension d12. Gravity is the ultimate anchor that provides the tension for this entire dimensional structure to exist.
Okay, so we have the speed of light and the anchor of gravity. Then we have t, the interaction time. In the paper, for high-energy collider physics like at CERN, this t is at 10 to the negative 13 seconds. Now, I want to clarify where that number comes from, because it's vital. We show this isn't just arbitrary math.
Right.
The actual measured lifetime of a Higgs boson before it vanishes is incredibly fast, around 10 to the negative 22 seconds. But Dukas doesn't use that exact number. Why?
Because of the dimensional projection we discussed. Remember the descent from higher dimensions?
Yeah.
The Codex posits that there is a 9-tier dimensional projection stretching from the D3 mass gate all the way up to the D12 gravitational origin. Each of those dimensional tiers projects an order of magnitude of time. So to find the true underlying interaction time of the gate itself, you take the experimental lifetime, 10 to the negative 22, and you multiply it by 10 to the 9th power, accounting for those 9 tiers.
And when you do that, 10 to the negative 22 multiplied by 10 to the 9th gives you 10 to the negative 13 seconds, the exact number in the formula. That is internally consistent logic. It's not a random variable.
It is entirely consistent with the framework's internal geometry. And finally, in the formula, we divide all of that by d squared, which represents a D2 coupling scale. It is roughly 8.987 times 10 to the 9th. In physics, this is essentially the canonical electromagnetic Coulomb scale. It mathematically represents the rigid constraints of the 2D photon plane.
So Dukas takes all these massive fundamental constants, the speed of light, the gravitational anchor, the projected timescale of the interaction, and the mathematical constraint of the 2D plane. He plugs them all into the formula to find the exact threshold where a particle is allowed to leave the 2D plane and enter 3D mass. What is the result?
The result of that calculation is approximately 2.23 times 10 to the negative 25 kilograms.
which is an unimaginably small amount of mass. But particle physicists don't usually weigh subatomic particles in kilograms, do they? They use energy units, thanks to Einstein's famous equation, E=mc², which proves mass and energy are interchangeable.
Right. So if we convert that exact kilogram value into giga-electron volts, or GeV, which is the standard metric used at particle colliders, the number comes out to approximately 125 GeV.
Let me stop you. 125 GeV. That is the exact measured mass of the Higgs boson discovered at CERN.
Exactly. And the philosophical implication of this calculation is staggering. In the standard model, the Higgs boson is a fundamental particle, like an electron, that just happens to be attached to a universal molasses field. But in this dimensional codex, the Higgs boson is not primarily a standard particle at all.
What is it then?
It is an operational manifestation of a dimensional permission spike. Think about the photon plane again. You have light, pure energy restricted to a flat 2D existence. But when you build a massive machine like the Large Hadron Collider and you smash particles together with terrifying force, you create localized spikes of extreme energy.
All right.
The codex is saying that when a localized excitation of energy on that 2D plane reaches exactly 125 GeV, it achieves enough momentum to overcome the 2D constraint. It hits the threshold. The geometry of the universe suddenly permits it to access the D3 volumetric structure.
The mass permission gate. I want to use an analogy here, because visualizing 2D planes turning into 3D volume is tough. Imagine a hyper-exclusive nightclub. It's the 3D mass club.
I love this.
Outside the club, on the flat 2D sidewalk, you have millions of photons milling around. They are moving at the speed of light, they have energy, they have momentum, but they are entirely massless because they are stuck on the flat sidewalk. They cannot get into the club. But standing at the door of the club is a bouncer. And that bouncer is the strict geometric math of the dimensional gate. The bouncer has one rule. You cannot cross this threshold, enter the 3D club, and acquire volumetric mass unless you hand me exactly 125 giga-electron volts of energy.
That is a brilliant way to visualize the mechanism. The bouncer is completely unyielding. Anything less than 125 GeV stays on the sidewalk.
But then CERN comes along. They smash things together on the sidewalk with so much violence that suddenly a cluster of energy hits exactly 125 GeV.
The bouncer steps aside.
The energy crosses the threshold. It steps into the club. It instantly inflates, acquiring 3D volumetric structure, and becomes physically massive. Our detectors at CERN see that momentary spike of mass, and we cheer and hand out Nobel Prizes and call it the Higgs boson.
Yep.
But the particle is incredibly unstable in that state, so almost instantly it decays. It drops back out of the club, loses its 3D volume, stiffs back onto the 2D sidewalk, and turns back into massless energy.
And we must point out a crucial piece of experimental evidence that perfectly aligns with this. When the Higgs boson decays, what is one of the primary, most famous ways the physicists at CERN actually detect it?
It decays into 2 photons.
Exactly. It decays back into 2 units of light. In the standard model, that's just a quantum statistical probability. But in the TDUFT codex, it is a geometric inevitability. The decay into 2 photons is simply the dimensional structure relaxing. The energy is dropping back down the harmonic step out of D3 and returning to its native base state on the D2 photon plane. The mass just steps back out onto the sidewalk. Every single number in this framework is interlocked.
Okay, my mind is thoroughly expanded by that, but it also creates a massive mechanical problem that I need you to solve.
What's the problem?
We keep talking about this D2 plane, this sidewalk that light travels along. We say light propagates through it, but what is it actually moving through? Standard physics tells us that space is a vacuum. It is an empty void of nothingness. How can pure nothingness have dimensions or planes or structural rules?
That is the perfect question. And it brings us to another massive validation in the paper, the redefinition of the vacuum itself. The TDUFT framework argues that the vacuum of space is not nothing. It is an incredibly complex, elastic metamaterial. And the proof for this is hidden right back in our original speed of light equation.
Okay, take me back to the equation. Where is the proof of an elastic material?
Think back to the golden ratio harmonics we added together, phi to the -1 and phi to the -2.
Right, 0.618 and 0.382. The 2 fractions that sum up perfectly to our harmonic step of 1.
The codex argues that these are not just abstract mathematical terms. They represent literal physical wave speeds moving through the medium of space. Specifically, the paper decomposes the total speed of light into 2 distinct components. It maps phi to the -1 to the speed of a longitudinal wave, and it maps phi to the -2 to the speed of a transverse wave.
We need to define those wave types for anyone whose high school physics is a little rusty. Let's start with transverse waves.
A transverse wave is what most people picture when they think of a wave. Imagine holding one end of a jump rope while a friend holds the other, and you whip your arm up and down. The wave travels forward toward your friend, but the actual rope is moving up and down, perpendicular to the direction of travel.
Okay, yeah.
Ocean waves behave similarly. The energy moves toward the shore, but the water bobs up and down.
Okay, jump rope, perpendicular motion. What about a longitudinal wave?
The longitudinal wave is a compression wave. Think of a slinky. If you stretch a slinky out and then push one end straight forward, you see a compressed coil of metal travel down the line. The vibration is happening in the exact same direction that the wave is traveling. It's a push and pull motion. Sound waves traveling through the air are longitudinal waves. They compress the air molecules.
Here's where the conflict arises. Since the time of Maxwell, classical electromagnetism has adamantly insisted that light traveling through a vacuum is purely a transverse wave. It is just the jump rope. There is no longitudinal compression component to light in a vacuum.
That is the entrenched dogma. But Dukas is challenging that directly. The TDUFT framework says that the vacuum absolutely supports both longitudinal and transverse wave components for light, and their respective propagation speeds are permanently phase-locked by the geometry of the golden ratio.
So the speed of the compression wave and the speed of the jump rope wave are mathematically tethered together.
Exactly. And if you take the speed of the longitudinal wave component and you divide it by the speed of the transverse wave component, the ratio you get is exactly phi, the golden ratio. 1.618.
Okay, but why does that ratio prove that space is an elastic material?
Because of solid-state physics. When you study the mechanical properties of physical materials in the real world, like a block of steel or a sheet of rubber or a quartz crystal, you measure how fast longitudinal and transverse waves move through them.
Like testing the strength of something.
Yes. Earthquakes are a great example. Earthquakes send out P waves, which are longitudinal, and S waves, which are transverse. By measuring the ratio of how fast those two waves travel through a material, engineers can calculate a fundamental property of that material called the Poisson ratio.
The Poisson ratio. I've heard engineers use that term. Break that down for me simply.
The Poisson ratio essentially measures how a material deforms when it is under stress. Imagine holding a thick, squishy rubber ball. If you place your hand on top of the ball and push straight down, compressing it longitudinally, what happens to the sides of the ball?
The sides bulge outward transversely.
Exactly. The Poisson ratio is a mathematical measurement of that specific deformation. It is the ratio of how much the material squishes inward compared to how much it bulges outward. Every solid elastic material has a specific Poisson ratio.
So if Dukas is claiming that light has both longitudinal and transverse wave speeds dictated by the golden ratio, he can take that ratio, plug it into standard solid-state engineering formulas, and calculate the Poisson ratio of empty space.
Yes, if you set the ratio of the wave speeds to the golden ratio, phi, and you solve the classical equation for the Poisson ratio, the math yields a very specific value. It comes out to approximately 0.191.
0.191. What does that number mean in the real world? If the vacuum of space has a Poisson ratio of 0.191, what kind of material is it similar to? Is it stiff, like a diamond, or squishy like Jell-O?
It is highly specific. A Poisson ratio of 0.191 is entirely physically plausible for a solid medium. In fact, it perfectly matches the measured elasticity of certain engineered metamaterials, highly ordered crystal lattices, and even specific biological tissues.
That is a complete paradigm shift. We are taught to view the universe as a vast, empty stage where particles just float around in the void. But this theory is saying the stage itself is made of something.
It is.
The vacuum is not empty. It is a highly structured, invisible, elastic crystal. It has a literal, measurable stiffness. It distributes stress and bulges just like a rubber ball, and its elasticity is entirely tuned by the golden ratio. We've just spent the last century only noticing the transverse jump rope waves, completely ignoring the invisible crystal vibrating around us.
Which brings us to the final and perhaps most elegant piece of this puzzle. If the vacuum is an elastic material, it completely explains the elephant in the room that we introduced in the very first segment.
The epsilon, the tiny microscopic fraction that we subtracted from the perfect number 3 to get the exact speed of light. Let's finally tackle this. Why is the speed of light 2.9979 times 10 to the 8th? Why isn't it the mathematically perfect integer 3? Where exactly does that 0.0007542 leakage come from?
As we discussed earlier, standard physics looks at that messy decimal and shrugs. They say the universe is imperfect, it's just a measured constant. But the TDUFT codex proves that this epsilon is not a random decimal. It is the exact mathematically convergent limit of an infinite series.
An infinite series. For those unfamiliar, an infinite series in calculus is when you add an infinite sequence of shrinking numbers together. And even though you're adding numbers forever, the fractions get so small that they eventually stop growing and home in on one specific stable boundary number. That's the convergent limit.
Precisely. The epsilon is the result of an infinite calculation. And what it is calculating is leakage into higher dimensions. We established the D2 photon plane and the D3 mass volume, but the codex posits an infinite tower of structural dimensions above us, D4, D5, D6, stretching infinitely upward.
Like an infinite skyscraper built on top of our 3D reality.
Yes. Now imagine light propagating through the vacuum. Because the vacuum is an elastic metamaterial, as the light waves vibrate, they put stress on the medium. A tiny, almost imperceptible fraction of the light's energetic budget couples into the hidden, higher-dimensional harmonics of the crystal structure. It bleeds upward.
It's losing a microscopic fraction of its perfect forward speed because it's slightly vibrating the higher dimensions. It's leaking.
It is leaking. And the infinite series that calculates exactly how much it leaks is breathtakingly elegant. It is governed entirely by a 3-4-5 Pythagorean triangle geometry.
The classic right triangle from high school geometry classes. 3 squared plus 4 squared equals 5 squared. How does a simple triangle govern interdimensional light leakage?
Because that triangle is the geometric bridge between dimensions. The 3 represents our D3 volumetric reality. The 4 represents the mathematical square of the 2D plane, 2 squared. And the 5 is the hypotenuse that links them.
Okay, follow that.
And inside the number 5, structurally, is the square root of 5, which is the foundational mathematical ingredient of the golden ratio itself.
So the geometry of the dimensions is dictating the math of the series.
Exactly. This geometric constraint manifests in the infinite series in 2 ways. First, as a fifth root, phi to the 1/5 power. Second, as a massive projection suppression factor. It suppresses the leakage by a factor of 1/4 to the 5th power, which equals 1 over 1024.
Meaning that only a tiny, tiny fraction of the energy is allowed to bleed upward. The rest is kept trapped in the lower dimensions.
Yes. And finally, the infinite series applies a damping exponent of n to the -8th power. This perfectly matches the 8-layer structural descent from D8 to D2 that we talked about earlier. Every layer damps the leakage further.
This is unbelievable. So you take the infinite cascade of golden ratio harmonics, you damp them by the 8-layer descent, you suppress them using the geometry of a 3-4-5 dimensional triangle, you add up an infinite number of these microscopic mathematical leakages, and the series perfectly converges on the number 0.00007542.
It does. It calculates the exact attenuation factor of the speed of light. It is not a fudge factor. It is the exact mathematical cost of projecting a perfect geometry down through 8-dimensional layers into an elastic reality. The speed of light isn't a random decimal. It is a perfect integer that has paid an exact geometric tax to the higher dimensions.
The geometric tax, I love that. But this elasticity, it doesn't just explain the speed of light. It solves another massive glaring problem in modern particle physics, doesn't it?
It solves what is arguably the most frustrating problem in quantum mechanics, the running of the fundamental constants.
I have been waiting to get to this. Explain to the listener what it means for a law of physics to run, because the word constant implies that it never changes.
You would think so. Let's look at the fine structure constant, represented by the Greek letter alpha. This is the constant that dictates the strength of the electromagnetic interaction. It determines how tightly electrons are bound to atoms. It governs the color of light emitted by stars.
Very important stuff.
Critical stuff. At our normal, low, everyday energy levels, physicists measure alpha to be roughly 1 over 137.5. It seems perfectly stable. It is a constant.
But then we build things like the Large Hadron Collider.
Right. When physicists smash particles together at incredibly high violent energies in these colliders, they measure the fine structure constant again. And suddenly, it's not 1 over 137.5 anymore. It changes. At high energies, it shifts to roughly 1 over 127.
The constant physically runs. It changes its value based on how much energy is in the room. How does standard physics cope with that? Because if your constants aren't constant, your mathematical models break down entirely. You start getting answers that equal infinity.
Standard physics deals with it by using a mathematical technique called ad hoc renormalization.
Renormalization. The famous physicist Richard Feynman hated renormalization, didn't he? He called it a dippy process and essentially said it was mathematically sweeping infinities under the rug.
He did, and many physicists still feel that way. Renormalization is essentially mathematical spackle. It's a way of artificially tweaking the equations after the fact to force the math to match the experimental results without actually understanding why the constant changed in the first place.
That seems like cheating.
It feels like it, yes. But the TDUFT framework eliminates the need for renormalization entirely because it introduces a critical distinction, rigid versus elastic constants.
Explain how that fixes the problem.
In Dugas's model, the pure geometry, the golden ratio base notes, the perfect three, the foundational architecture, is absolutely rigid. It is a mathematical truth that never ever changes regardless of how much energy you apply. But the epsilon, the dimensional leakage, the interaction with the vacuum is inherently elastic.
Because the vacuum itself is an elastic metamaterial.
Exactly. The epsilon adjusts dynamically based on the energy scale. When you violently smash particles together in a collider, you are pumping massive amounts of localized energy into the elastic crystal of the vacuum. You are temporarily deforming the medium.
You were stressing the rubber ball.
Yes. And because you have deformed the elastic medium, the rate of harmonic leakage, the epsilon, changes. The fundamental geometric constant of the universe didn't actually alter its nature. It is simply the elastic response of the vacuum reacting to extreme stress. The running of the constants is just the physical deformation of higher dimensional leakage.
I think of it like an acoustic guitar string. The bass note, the geometric truth of that string's length, mass, and tension never changes. It is a rigid constant.
Right.
But imagine playing that exact same string in a small, heavily padded, soundproof room. It sounds muted. Then you take the guitar and play that exact same string inside a massive, tiled, Gothic cathedral. The note sounds completely different to the listener.
That's a great comparison.
The string didn't change. The bass geometry is identical. But the harmonic echoes, the way the sound bleeds into the environment, the way the acoustic space reacts, the epsilon, has changed completely based on the environment. Standard physics hears the different sound in the cathedral and panics, tweaking their equations to invent a new note. Dugas says, relax, it's the same note. You just changed the acoustic elasticity of the room.
That is the perfect synthesis. The pure mathematics of the golden ratio provide the rigid base note. The infinite dimensional tower and the elastic metamaterial of the vacuum provide the elastic harmonics. And together, inextricably linked, they produce the exact, measurable, sometimes messy reality that we observe through our instruments.
Okay, we have covered a truly massive, staggering amount of conceptual ground here today. If you are listening to this on a commute or while doing dishes, let's briefly recap the journey we just took, because the internal consistency of this theory is what makes it so compelling. We started with a number that everyone knows but no one questions. The speed of light, 299,792,458 meters per second.
We unpacked that seemingly random number using George James Dugas's equation, revealing how it is perfectly constructed using the algebra of the golden ratio to create a foundational base of 3 minus a calculated leakage factor.
We took that new geometric formulation and plugged it into Maxwell's classical equations for electromagnetism and watched it magically solve the mystery of the arbitrary 9, proving that electric fields interact based on the square of that golden ratio trinity.
We decoded the physical meaning of those numbers through the dimensional codex. We saw the D2 massless photon plane separated by a one-unit harmonic step, leading up into the D3 world of volumetric mass.
We applied that specific dimensional geometry to the mass permission gate, calculating the exact energetic threshold required for light to thicken into mass, landing with terrifying precision on the 125 GeV signature of the Higgs boson, the bouncer at the club.
We analyzed the wave components of light, proving that the ratio of longitudinal to transverse speeds dictates a specific Poisson ratio, entirely redefining the empty vacuum of space as a structured, elastic metamaterial.
And finally, we track the infinite cascading geometric leakage of light into higher dimensions, regulated by a 3-4-5 triangle, solving the decades-old mystery of why physical constants appear to run at high energies. It is an incredibly cohesive, interlocking puzzle. Standard physics sees these as a dozen separate, unrelated mysteries. The TDUFT framework links them all to a single root cause, the structural geometry of the golden ratio.
It forces a complete foundational paradigm shift. For the last century, quantum physics has been on a relentless hunt to find the ultimate particle. They keep smashing things into smaller and smaller pieces, hoping the next tiny fragment will explain the universe.
Yeah.
This theory suggests that approach is entirely backward. The particles are not the foundation. The particles are just the symptoms. The geometry is the disease. The mathematical structure of the dimensions themselves dictates what can and cannot exist.
Which brings me to a final, slightly provocative thought I want to leave you with. We've talked a lot about abstract math, photons, and particle accelerators. But if this theory holds true, if the speed of light is truly just the eigenvalue of an 8-dimensional projection, and if physical mass is nothing more than a 3D permission gate, I want you to look at your own hand right now. Literally, if you aren't driving, look at your hand.
Take a close look at it.
Every single atom in your hand, every ounce of mass that makes up your skin, your bones, the blood moving through your veins, the phone or the steering wheel you might be holding, all of it only has physical mass because the underlying geometry of the universe mathematically permitted it to cross from a flat 2D plane into a 3D volume. You aren't just an isolated object sitting inside an empty, dead universe. You are a localized spike in its dimensional geometry. Your very physical existence, your weight, your ability to touch the world, it is an ongoing, active permission granted by the harmonic ratios of the cosmos. You are the golden ratio, thickened into reality.
When you begin to view the universe through that lens, the diagnostic muddy waters of theoretical physics suddenly stop looking like mud. They start looking a lot like a mirror.
And suddenly, that tape measure we talked about at the very beginning of the deep dive, the one we used to measure the simple binary facts of the world, it isn't broken at all. It was just calibrated to the wrong dimension. We have spent hundreds of years looking at the shadows, measuring them, and assuming they were the bones of reality. But the bones are made of pure mathematical geometry. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the shadows, keep looking for the blueprints, and never stop unpacking the reality around you. We'll see you next time.